and welcome to Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host, Ray Smith. Good morning, Ray.
Good morning, Keith. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. Ray, let's just we are recording this on Saturday, June the 3rd,
That's
I
right.
guess, and we're in the middle of the Flatwater Tales Storytelling Festival. Why don't you give us, before we get started, why don't you give us a little bit update on that? Because I know
Oh,
you've been involved with that.
yeah, I'd be very happy to do that. And I think I may make a connection today to see if I can get Bill Lepp to be on one of our video casts. But anyway, the Flatwater Tales Storytelling Festival is in the historic Grove Theater this weekend. We had the first evening session last night. There's a morning session going on today, and then a session at 2 o'clock and one at 7. And the one I'm most interested in is the one at 7, where Bill Lepp, a renowned storyteller and just a really good individual, is going to be telling the story about John Hendricks, the prophet of Oak Ridge. And of course, he and I have been in contact for months now. I gave him a book, and he's seen our video, and he has asked several questions about the association of Hendricks and the story of John Hendricks and Oak Ridge. So he'll be telling that story tonight. There was a full house last night. It was a good program. So Flatwater Tales is doing fine.
All right, well, good. Well, we have a special guest with us today, Ray. Why don't you introduce him?
And speaking of storytelling, one of the best world-renowned storytellers is Cormac McCarthy. And I happen to be connected by Jake Morrow, connected us with me with Bill Hardwig, who's a professor at UT and at the University of Tennessee. And he has done research into Cormac McCarthy's writings and has produced a talk about that we want to share with you today. So, Bill, go ahead and give a better introduction of yourself than I've been able to do. And then let's go ahead into the talk. And then we'll have some question and answers about it, okay?
Okay. I'm really thrilled to be here. I think that introduction was pretty good. I teach American literature and 20th century literature here at UT, which is how I got into the teaching and then researching about Cormac McCarthy. It just makes perfect sense, the fact that he was around here, to incorporate that into my work, and students love reading his stuff. So just to give you a little bit of a slight background about what I'll be talking about today. This past winter, Cormac McCarthy, who I think most people probably knew, grew up in the Knoxville area, released his 11th and 12th novels. The first, since his very popular The Road, which probably a lot of people remember from 2006. But the two he released this past winter were companion novels. You have The Passenger. Sorry, I'm really bad at doing this. The Passenger and Stella Maris. And I think you can sort of see in the way they're designed that they're kind of seen as companion pieces. But anyway, these are very interesting, but also very confusing novels. They have magical elements sometimes, which is kind of strange for McCarthy. They engage in high-level math and physics, which is new for McCarthy. Have wide-ranging accounts of 20th century history, and combined, I think you probably saw, they're over 600 pages long. So it's a substantial bit of work here that has come out into 2022. So at a recent conference I was at, some McCarthy scholars began trying to make sense of these books. And I decided as my contribution to focus on McCarthy's imaginative return to East Tennessee and his decision to place parts of the books in Wartburg and Oak Ridge during the Second World War. So Ray asked me if I'd read a version of a short paper I gave at the conference. So I'll start with that. But then I look forward to our conversations about the topic.
Let me add just a bit of preamble to your talk before you start. As most of you will know, I've been an employee of Y12 for 47 years before retiring. And as fortune would have it, Dennis McCarthy, who is Cormac's brother, contacted me and wanted to learn about what a Calytron girl would experience if she came into Y12 during the Manhattan Project. So as you viewers also know, we still have Calytrons. It stands for California University Cyclotron, invented by Ernest Lawrence, and they're still in beta 3 at the building 9204-3 in Y12. So I took Dennis into that building, and we made photographs for him and answered his questions. And so then I thought, well, okay, that was good, an interesting experience. And he assured me that Cormac was going to write that into a book. Well, I thought, well, he may or may not, I don't know, but we'll see. But I maintained contact with Dennis over the years. He lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Fanny and I were out there once a few years ago and had lunch with him and his wife. And we've continued to be in contact. By the way, Dennis just had a book come out, Bill, as you know, The Gospel According to Billy the Kid, and I've got a signed copy of that. Now, and I'm about through here, folks, but I want you to know that my two sons, Zane and Mike, are fans of Cormac McCarthy, and there's something that is a rare commodity that I've been able to do for them. Cormac does not sign normally, doesn't do autographs. But because I took Dennis into Y12, I imposed on him. And I said, Dennis, I want my two sons to have a signed copy of a Cormac McCarthy book. Can you get that for me? He did. So Mike and Zane both have signed copies of Cormac McCarthy book. Bill, I bet you don't have one of those.
I do not. I do not. Absolutely not. That's a real treasure. Yeah.
So I don't want to take away from what you're about to say, but I wanted people to know just how much I enjoyed and continue to enjoy the interaction with Dennis McCarthy. And so now give us your talk on Cormac's books.
Well, yeah, just as a little bit of background, Ray helped me figure out some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today about the history of Oak Ridge that shows up in these novels, and just a little bit of background that I'm not going to talk about specifically. The main character, Bobby, his mother was from the East Tennessee area and worked as a Calytron girl in the novel, and his father came from Princeton and was involved in the sort of theoretical physics part of the Oak Ridge, the Manhattan Project. So I'm sure I have some errors in here, so Ray can correct me afterwards, but I'll just read here for a little bit. McCarthy's first widely popular Western novel, All the Pretty Horses, takes place not in the frontier of the 19th century when you might expect to find a desert horseback thriller. Instead, it is set in the era of Heisenberg, Invisible Man, and John Wayne, as James Lilly puts it. So the Western topic of the book was in many ways an elegy for a culture already gone, or an escape from the realities of the atomic age. McCarthy himself gestures in this direction briefly in his other novel, Cities of the Plain, when he mentions how the country had, in one man's lifetime, gone from the horse and buggy to the atomic bomb. In his most recent books, The Passenger and Stella Morris, the surname of the central character, Bobby Western, might serve as a nod to these earlier novels and their interest in the wild frontier. But in these twin novels, the atomic age takes center stage as McCarthy explores the key role that his childhood home of the greater Knoxville, Tennessee area played in the atomic age. The East Tennessee in these novels is no bucolic getaway or backwater remnant of an earlier era, which was the case with earlier novels. Rather, McCarthy places his characters in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a mere 25 miles from Knoxville. The secret city of Oak Ridge's laboratories that produced enriched uranium plays a central role in the Manhattan Project, and Oak Ridge was built by the national government almost overnight in 1942. Now, this I was explaining to McCarthy people. I'm sure your listeners know all this information better than I do. but as a sort of fast track to the nation's atomic projects during World War II. In a matter of months, Oak Ridge came to house, I believe, over 30,000 workers. And by 1945, the city had, I think, around 70,000 people. So it really just sprung up almost overnight. So from one perspective, it makes sense that McCarthy would turn his attention to the East Tennessee portion of the Manhattan Project to tell his story of a family of scientific stars and the burdens of being a mathematical genius. But from another perspective, the interest in this location north of Knoxville marks a radical departure from his other Tennessee novels that tend to be centered in the downtown area of Knoxville, if you know Suttree, or in the rural foothills and mountains to the south of the city. That's where most of his Tennessee novels take place. I can find little evidence that McCarthy had much connection to Oak Ridge or Wartburg areas of East Tennessee at all. Perhaps Dennis's visit with Ray was especially important because Cormac wasn't as familiar with some of the history and the just location. But what I want to suggest is that McCarthy chooses this unfamiliar location to return in his latest work to a very familiar theme. Those of you who've read a lot of McCarthy stuff will recognize this. The idea of government overreach and its detrimental effects on those who are less connected to the bureaucracies associated with that government. More specifically, McCarthy intentionally conflates the region's displacement of folks from the TVA electricity projects of the early to mid-century and the 1940s displacement to make room for the new atomic city, Oak Ridge. The thematic conflation between these makes sense when we consider the role that the characters Bobby and Alicia's father played in the science that enacted the Oak Ridge displacements, especially when we consider McCarthy's own father's role as general counsel for TVA in charge of earlier displacements in East Tennessee. Fathers have always been difficult figures in McCarthy's fiction, but here the link between governmental overreach and its effect on the powerless feels particularly focused. The storyline in these novels illuminates a tension between alternative histories. You have the official and international story of the atomic bomb, which shows up in the book, and then the smaller but regional story of displacement of poor working and farming families that played a key role in the nation's expansion into a global power. We see McCarthy's version of this anti-government and anti-displacement stance in The Passenger, most notably when Bobby visits Wartburg and listens to his grandmother's recounting of the family's history. So we learn from Gran Ellen, who's his grandmother, that her grandfather and uncle built a house in Anderson County in 1872. Both Gran Ellen and Alicia's her granddaughter, versions of this house construction are filled with McCarthy's attention to craft that runs throughout his career. He loves to talk about things that are well made, put together in a particularly proficient and caring way. So this is a quote from Gran Ellen, who's talking about the building of that house. She said, "I don't know how they knew to do what they done, Bobby. I want to say they could have done anything. That house was the most beautiful house I ever saw. Every floor in it was solid walnut, and some of them boards was close to 3 foot wide. All of it hand planed, all of it at the bottom of a lake." Alicia, her granddaughter in Stella Maris, the second book, offers a similar version of the family story. And so this is her quote. "I've seen photographs of the house, and it was quite beautiful. They'd never built a house before. I'm not sure how they'd ever seen one built. What if they could have seen 80 years into the future? That's not very long. The simplest undertaking is predicated upon a future that has no warrant." So those of us familiar with McCarthy can maybe hear in that story echoes of Sheriff Bell in No Country for Old Men or The Father in the Road, with this question about the role of craft and beauty in a world that has outlived a belief in its future. So what is the role of beauty if we no longer sort of have faith in the continuing of the world as we know it? So then we learn in the novel that this treasured house that we just heard so lovingly about was lost as part of the requisitioning of land for the Manhattan Project in the area around Clinton, Tennessee, that would soon be called Oak Ridge. Gran Ellen places this family loss into a larger framework of what she sees as governmental overreach leading to the dispossession of local residents. So this is a grandmother again, this quote from The Passenger. We tried to hold on to it, talking about the house, but they just took it. You had 2 weeks notice. Then you had to be gone. You wasn't even supposed to take the furniture, but most did. They'd leave out in the middle of the night like thieves. It was hard. I know they was families got thrown off their farms in the 30s by the TVA and come to Anderson County and got thrown off all over again. There was even families that had been removed from their homesteads in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in the 30s, TVA in the 30s again, and the atom bomb in the 40s. By that time, they didn't have nothing. So this recounting again overlaps with Alicia's, her granddaughters. And in a flashback, we have her sitting at a dressing table, and she thinks, a dressing table which had belonged to her great-grandmother and which had been taken out of a house in Anderson County that night, even as the waters were rising. In the drawer of the dressing table was a packet of letters tied with a blue silk ribbon, antique stamps, and a script in brown ink penned with a quill, addressed to a house whose stones now lay in the silt at the bottom of a lake. This sense of an ancient and unrecoverable family history, the letters penned with a quill, suggests that it was more than just the building and the house that was lost in the dispossession. It was sort of a part of a family history, a family tradition. But I think one of the things that's interesting in the way that McCarthy writes this, and this is what I asked Ray with help to try to find, to untangle, is that in their stories of the family home, Grant Ellen and Alicia merge 4 moments of 20th century governmental displacement of East Tennessee citizens. 1, you have the displacement caused by flooding as a result of the damming of the local rivers by the TVA. 2, the claiming of family lands that led to create the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Both of those were in the 1930s. 3, you have the claiming of land necessary to make the uranium enrichment laboratories in Oak Ridge in the 1940s, which led to this family's loss of their house. And 4, the subsequent loss of property connected with the flooding, near as Ray and I can tell, caused by the Melton Hill Dam in the 1960s, again engineered by the TVA. This last dam project is presumably what left the family home in these novels at the bottom of the lake that they talk about again. And I think when I talked to Ray, he said that such flooding of homes would have been extremely unlikely during this part of the project, the post-war damming. But I think it fits McCarthy's narrative about dispossession and the submersion of the past quite well. Historical accuracy be damned. I think he cared more about the thematic resonance than the actual history. But what makes Grant Ellen's story so confusing from a historical perspective is that with the memories of 4 separate moments of governmental claims of eminent domain become almost indistinguishable in the novels. Indeed, distinguishing between them almost seems to miss the point. And this is where I originally asked Ray for help. The first several times I read Grant Ellen's story, the mention of the house being underwater turned my attention to the prominent flooding of the area in the 1930s. But that didn't make sense in the novel since they knew they lost their house in the 1940s and with the war project. So with Ray's help, I think we can reconstruct McCarthy's representation of the history in the novels, where the family lost their home in the 1940s, moved to a rental property in Clinton, and then were further forced to relocate to Wartburg, further west and outside of the nuclear project's domain. So their home in Wartburg is a sign of their being sort of forced relocation. And I think this forced relocation is perhaps the key aspect of Bobby and Alicia's maternal family's history. And it's symbolized by the family's home at the bottom of a lake that has real resonance in these novels. So even as McCarthy turns to new territory with the interest in theoretical mathematics and atomic science in these novels, he emphasizes a theme that has been around since his very first novel: the ways in which our technological development and governmental policies often come at the expense of the dispossessed lower and middle class working folk, something that he returns to time and time again in his novels. So sort of coming to the end here, in The Passenger and Stella Maris, these personal and familial stories that are told by Bobby, Alicia, and Grant Ellen can be contrasted with another history, one with which Bobby is equally well versed. Bobby is also a physicist, and which appears. So this quote I'm going to read, which is from Bobby's perspective, comes right before we hear Grant Ellen's story about the family home and the being dispossessed or displaced from World War II. And this is from Bobby's perspective. Somewhere beyond his grandmother's community in Wartburg, the installation at Oak Ridge for enriching uranium that had led to his father here from Princeton in 1943, and where he'd met the beauty queen he would marry. That's Bobby's mother, the Calutron girl. Western fully understood he owed his existence to Adolf Hitler, that the forces of history which had ushered his troubled life into the tapestry were those of Auschwitz and Hiroshima, the sister events that sealed forever the fate of the West. So early in The Passenger, there's this character who's actually based on a real life person named John Shedden, both in the novel and in real life. John Shedden is talking to a bartender, Bianca, and they're in New Orleans at this time, but these unusual Knoxville characters keep showing up at the bars in New Orleans. And Bianca's who's not from Knoxville, is trying to figure this out. And this is one of my favorite passages from these novels. It's really funny. But Bobby asks John, does Knoxville produce crazy people or does it just attract them? And then Shedden responds, interesting question. Nature, nurture. Actually, the more deranged of them seem to hail from the neighboring hinterlands. So I think, just to end up here, like the characters like Marion Sylder and Arthur Owenby from his first novel, if you're familiar with that, Jean Harrigan in the fourth, Suttree, Bobby's maternal family hails from these neighboring hinterlands. And as is the case with the development of all of these characters, McCarthy's attention and empathy consistently turns towards the folks off the beaten path and their stories that are so often left out of our nations, our regions, and our cities' histories. So that was the approach I was taking in this talk.
I think that's a good synopsis of McCarthy's work, and the way you tied those together makes a lot of sense. His ability to identify with the less advantaged people and they're in their defense, but also the characters that he introduces, you can really appreciate them. He brings them to life in such a way that you can identify with them. And although you haven't touched a lot on it, I was delighted when, in fact, you pointed out some of the sections in the book that dealt specifically with Oak Ridge and with Y-12. And I was delighted to find that the conversations I had with Dennis were very accurately portrayed in the book. You could identify, or I could, having that memory, could identify where that information came from. So obviously I take a lot of pride, and I did buy copies of those two books for both my sons and myself. So I think that's interesting connection to Oak Ridge.
Do you think?
Yeah, I think I said he played a little loose with the history of flooding, I think, to make his point. But I think it was really important for him to try to get the Y-12 scenes accurately depicted. So those of you who haven't read the books, I won't give away everything, but those characters' mother was one of the ones working in the lab. One of the things Ray and I talked about is I asked Ray how accurate this was, and I think you felt it was pretty accurate about people doing parts of the process, so like monitoring and these gauges, but without understanding the full project, even what they were monitoring, except what the gauges should read. So he does spend some time in the novel talking about the secrecy of the project and how they kept the different, the different segments of it isolated so that they didn't know exactly what they were doing. It sounds fascinating.
Bill, let me ask a question. Do you think you've talked a little bit about this thread that kind of goes through all of his work and all of his novels. and I'm certain that he was influenced being from East Tennessee and seeing all around him. You know, the people were moved away to many of them came to Oak Ridge, what was going to be Oak Ridge from Norris, okay, when they were
Yeah.
building the Norris Dam. You've got
Right.
Cherokee Dam up in Granger County. You know, that was flooded. You've got Loudon Dam. You've got all these dams, and then you've got the Oak Ridge project that was eminent domain. So, as a Knoxvillian or being in East Tennessee, much of his life or much of his memories are of all this, people being moved and the government coming in and forcing them to move. So
Mhm.
surely there's that has to influence that thread through all of his work, I would imagine, over the
Yeah,
years.
I think so very much, and I think especially in his Tennessee novels, you could just list characters who are being, it's not always the government, but being forced out of their homes, forced into new places, losing their connection to family homes, to their ways of living, often from rural spaces into more managed or urban spaces. So that's a huge interest of his. One thing that I just briefly mentioned in here, because there's not a lot of this information about it, but I think it's fascinating that his father was
Yeah,
general counsel for TVA and was brought, and they actually, he was from Rhode Island, came down in the 30s exactly to deal with, I'm not quite sure what general counsel would do. All maybe one of you know a little bit about this, but he was involved in helping people relocate, would be the generous way of putting it, or dispossessing would be the other way. And so I think McCarthy has, had a distrust of these sort of forced displaces, clearly made a big part of impact on him. And I think you're right that growing up in the area, he grew up mainly in south of the city, just off of Clinton Highway, south of Knoxville, but an area that was in some ways rural, but also in other ways was the city was sort of coming out that way, off of Martin Mill Pike. He actually lived there for a while. And even something like, I don't know, probably the most famous book for people around here is Suttree. That is set in the past. It was written in the 70s or published in the 70s, but was set around 1950. And it is the main character is living on the shore in a houseboat. And I don't know quite the whole history of that, but at some point, I think TVA outlawed the allowing people sort of free docking. I think at one point, if I'm correct, the water was sort of free, and if you were on the water, you were not under the auspices of. And then at some point in between then and the publishing of the novel, they were no longer allowed to do that. So even something simple like that shows the sort of ways in which I think McCarthy often sees it as freedom, people's individual freedoms were being encroached upon by larger structure, governmental structures, that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I think that's.
Do you know very much about his relationship with his father? I mean, he seems to be at odds there with the work that his father did.
I think very much. And he's very private person, as Ray was he's a very warm person, but very private about. We still don't know some of the major things of his biography, when he went where exactly what he was doing when, so we don't know a lot, but it seemed like it was, if you read the fiction, at least it seemed kind of prickly
Yeah.
with his father. Some of that would have to do with that. I think also religion maybe played a part of that, but he was raised in the Catholic schools around Knoxville, and then later had some distance to that. But I think even if you go back to his very first things he ever published was he went to UT, never quite graduated. I think he refused to take a foreign language class that he didn't want to take or something, but he got almost the way through. And when he published his first two things in the UT literary journal called The Phoenix, which is actually still running today. And in one of those called The Drowning Incident, it's a young kid's perspective. And then his father's out at work and he hears that the little puppies that they had were given away, and he's disappointed because he liked the little puppies. So he's wandering around in the woods, and then he sees these little puppies float down the stream, and a sack, so a burlap sack. So he learns that his father probably drowned the puppies is what happens. That's what he thinks. So he grabs one of these puppies that now has, is partly rotting. And he takes that puppy, puts it in the baby's crib, and waits for his father to come home. And that's the ending of the story. And it's a really crazy story. But I think even that early, you can see the tension between, father as sort of a symbol of law and order, partly too, but I think probably his individual father in TVA. I mean, TVA never comes across very well in McCarthy's fiction. And you could, make the argument that it did a lot of really good things for a lot of people. That's not the angle that he's interested in exploring. I think, it's more like what you said, people being taken away from their family lands and being sort of at a loss of where to go.
Right. It's interesting. It's interesting when after we had the ash spill in Kingston, I grew up in Kingston, and my dad worked at the Kingston Steam Plant. He worked for TVA his entire career as a machinist. And I kind of toyed with the idea as a documentary filmmaker of doing a documentary on the ash spill later on. I even had meetings with some executives or vice presidents at TVA in Knoxville, at TVA Towers, about that. And my mother, and I was talking to my mother and father were both living at the time, and talking to my mother about it. And she says, remember, Keith, says, TVA, it was because of TVA that you were able to have food on the table and get a college degree.
Yeah.
And so there was always that perspective. And I would imagine that people in Oak Ridge that grew up from Oak Ridge, no matter how they feel about the results or the outcome of the Manhattan Project, have those same kinds of feelings about Oak Ridge and what it provided. And Ray and I both have seen this through our work, through our documentary work, is, there was that, as Cormac writes about the displacement and the people being moved and the government overreach. There's a flip side to that too, and the benefits that happened from that government overreach.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting that McCarthy almost always comes pretty one-sided.
Yeah.
He likes to get into the complexity of a lot of things, but in that issue, he doesn't often present the complexity. Even, Bobby, the son, seemed to realize that I think that was the point about Adolf Hitler, that there was a larger narrative and there were real needs, national, global needs that this was responding to. But it's kind of interesting that he doesn't give us any of the characters that would give that story. Instead, we get the grandmother whose grandfather had built a house that is now under a lake. That, as Ray said, it's hard to imagine, I think, how something would come to be under a lake after World War II anyway, because most of those
those dams were already built.
So he's clearly even distorting history to get to that thing, because you're absolutely right that there are.
Well, I mean, it is a fiction. I mean, it is. So he certainly has that literary license to tell the story, just like Hollywood does. They have literary license to be able, and creative license to be able to tell the best story. And
there's I don't know how many of the listeners will be familiar with his very first novel, The Orchard Keeper, but in there is this. I think this actually existed somewhere down there off of Martin Mill Pike, but an old orchard that had, I think it was an aeronautic, some sort of thing connected to the airport. But he never explains what it is in that novel. He calls it a sinister governmental icon, this gleaming metal thing. And then one of these characters who is being displaced by things fills it with shotgun shells at one point. So again, no sense to explain what it's doing there. The fact that it's rather innocuous is nobody was displaced for that. It was on an abandoned property, but somehow it becomes sort of sinister, and even more sinister because it's never explained. It's just this gleaming governmental metal object in the middle of the woods.
Right.
Let me make go ahead, Keith.
No, I was just going to ask a question. Cormac, you say it's very private, but was he political? I mean, was he vocal with political?
I don't think he makes first public appearances.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, some people have labeled him kind of like a hermit. Other people have said that's not the right way to think about it, that he's very warm socially, but he doesn't like public appearances. He was famously gave, I think, almost no interviews in the public. He did one in 1992 and then a couple when The Road came out. Mm-hmm. And people think that he was worried about maybe selling a little bit more to set up his family as he was aging. But yeah, so I'm sure you can maybe glean some of his political perspectives from reading the things. And I think even what we talked about today are suggesting some of them, but no, he was not very outwardly, he did not let his politics be publicly known very often.
Now, is he still living?
He is, yes. He's in Santa Fe.
About how old would he be now?
He is 90. He was born in 1933.
So as a young person, he saw a lot of this turbulence and turmoil, and yeah, like we talked about earlier, you can't hardly, let that not affect you and your perception of the world. I would imagine. Yeah.
And I do think they were brought down from Rhode Island for his father to help with this relocation in the late 30s. I think they moved here in 37. So yeah, so he would have heard about it from his family as well.
Sure.
So I have two tangents here I want to take us off on for just a moment. And the first one is, when you talk about that first book, I want to make an interesting Oak Ridge connection to that. Yeah. When was that? What was the setting? What year? In the 1920s or something?
Yeah, I'm trying to 20s, 30s.
Okay, that's close enough. Here in Oak Ridge, over near the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, there is a beacon house. And that beacon house was used in the 1920s, before radar was invented, was used to guide airplanes coming in, going to McGee-Tyson, so that there was another something out in a field or located somewhere that had something to do with airplanes in an early time period. It would have likely have been a beacon house. They were all over the area, guiding the planes into McGee-Tyson. And we fixed that one up here in Oak Ridge. It's being kept up, and one of the early historical objects of the area that still remains. It and the Friels Bend cabin, of course, are probably the oldest historical artifacts we have. Now, I want to take a really different tangent for just a minute. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but I've read his books. His punctuation is different. Talk about his writing style.
It is very different, and
no quotation marks.
No quotation marks. Often no possessive apostrophes. He also often doesn't let you know who's speaking, so it doesn't say Bobby said. It just somebody starts talking, then another person starts talking without quotation marks. So yeah, some people are really frustrated by that. I don't know the history of where he came to do that. One of his, a lot of people think he was influenced by William Faulkner, and he did some of that, but not as much, I think. But I just recently reviewed a book that looked at his correspondence with his editors in those Tennessee books, the first three. And they were saying, are you sure you want to do this? You sure you don't want to have quotation marks? You might use some more commas here. Why do you not use a period here? And he was very accommodating to editors about a lot of things, but he was very firm that that's the way he wanted to punctuate. One of his editors even said, I think it might make you look more like more influenced by Faulkner than you are, and you sort of makes it seem less of your own distinctive style. But for him, he was interested in writing words the way that he heard them in his head, I think. And he said that he didn't like all those little squiggly marks, I think. And he thought that made, especially dialogue, feel a little bit more artificial for him. And, one of the things you mentioned earlier, one of the things he does beautifully, I think, is hears and puts down on paper regional voices, just people from around East Tennessee. I think he's got a real, without doing a whole lot of changing of the spelling, I don't think I did it justice with the grandmother's reading today, but a real sense of the flow and rhythm of East Tennessee language. And I think the punctuation sometimes is to try to give us that sense of the oral voices that you have to put in writing.
I did not pursue this questioning with Dennis. I was more interested in other aspects of it.
Yeah.
My two sons and I have had conversation about reading his books. And once you get into it and start reading it, that punctuation, for me, that punctuation just goes away. It is not an issue. I get enthralled in the story and what's being said and done, and I can compensate for any of those things that are not there. They don't distract. And I find that very interesting.
I agree that sometimes I forget about it as I teach a lot of his novels, and then I'm just thinking about the words, and then they come in with what's going on with the punctuation. And then because I'd become accustomed to it, I don't even really see it without stepping out and thinking about it. Yeah.
And I would imagine, I would imagine that's an interesting perspective and an interesting philosophy for storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it less book-like.
Right.
In a book, it's, Ray said blah 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 blah. But if you just have the words, it's more of an oral history tradition, type storytelling. So
his third book, which is set around Maryville and into Sevier County and the mountains over around there, he has the story of the main character, Lester Ballard, and in between he just has sometimes people call them community chapters, but voices of people speaking in the first person that aren't talking about the same story. Sometimes they're talking about related things, but just telling little stories. Mm-hmm. And so, I think you're right. I also teach Appalachian literature, and there's an interesting history of trying to get regional voices into writing, because in some ways you hit the nail perfectly. It's trying to put a spoken thing onto a page, which is kind of ruining the experience of hearing the voice. So some of the first people who did this wrote tremendous amounts of dialect and lots of cutting off of words with apostrophes and spelling them the way they would be spoken. Mm-hmm. And it was really made it, I think they were trying to get those voices, but it made it more artificial in some ways. So like you had to read it as a puzzle, read it out loud, because you couldn't even hear it was too much. And then so people have been tinkering with that ever since, of how to get those voices in. I think for McCarthy, it's to get rid of some of those, the he saids, just the little taglines, the quotation marks that sort of register it as, okay, here comes something spoken, and make it feel a little bit more organic.
So that brings us full circle back to the Storytelling Festival that's here. And as you know, the International Storytelling in Jonesboro. So East Tennessee has a very current tradition in storytelling that's known nationwide. And they commented us, some of these professional storytellers, by talking about the Oak Ridge Flatwater Tales, that we started where most storytelling festivals are only after about 10 to 15 years. In other words, we made a jump start, and we did it because of having access to some of these very highly qualified professional storytellers, such as Bill Lepp. And oh, by the way, Bill spells his name Bill Leep or Lepp. So there's only one letter L in his first name, Bill. And so that's a hint of his character. And then when he's telling stories, he is very much in character with the story that's being told. And he's now writing a book of his stories. He's already written and published a few, but he's doing one now that has more of the stories in it. And it's going to be interesting to me to see how he conveys that spoken word into a written format. Or it's not easy to do. I write nonfiction. I have never attempted fiction. I don't know if I could do it or not. It seems to me to be a lot of work. Whereas writing nonfiction, you're just doing research and trying to accurately portray that research that you've done. In fiction, you're creating something out of whole cloth, if you know what I mean. And you've got to have that dialect. You've got to have the influence of the characters. It just seems to me to be very difficult to do.
Yeah,
I'm going to stick with nonfiction.
I think fiction writers might feel often that what you do is impossible to them. So maybe different people have their different things they lean on. But one of the things you talk about the storytelling festival with McCarthy. One of the things I learned in that recent book, Embracing Vocation by Diane Luce, about his early novels is he used to, he liked to go around wherever people were telling stories, whether it's a local bar or down by the river, or he was interested in hearing the stories that people were telling. And the things that I just learned is that he would sometimes write those down without a definite book to put them in, and then they would show up later. So he liked the stories, and then he said, okay, that's great. I'll put that down, and then I will find a place if it works later. So he was really committed to the idea of storytelling, and particularly the kind of stories that people tell around East Tennessee, I think.
It's interesting, Ray, you're talking, and both you and Phil were talking a while ago about the difference between, fiction and nonfiction. And, as you know, Ray, I wrote my one and only book a couple of years ago. And I did, I've written so many scripts, so many documentaries over the years, and I didn't really know how to approach it. And I approached it as though I wrote as though I'm sitting across the table from somebody just telling them a story. And so my chapters are fairly short, but it reminded me of a quote that I heard Ken Burns, the great documentary filmmaker Ken Burns. He was talking about his filmmaking process. And he says, Steven Spielberg and I, this is Ken Burns talking, Steven Spielberg and I employ the same process in making a film. He said, I just don't have the luxury of making things up. So that's exactly right. I think you may be right. And I've done a little bit of fiction. The bulk of my work as far as my filmography is documentary and historical documentary. But yeah, whether we write it or we make a movie, it's all about making sure that you're as historically accurate as possible, yet still engaging an audience in the story. And so it's interesting. It's interesting that McCarthy almost kind of merges those two realms in the fact that he takes real actual stories of people or things that he's heard and kind of encapsulates those into his fiction. So I just find that fascinating.
Yeah, I think when people were first thinking about Suttree, when that came out, which is just full of people telling stories, People were celebrating McCarthy's imagination and his ability to come up with such crazy stories and vibrant characters. And then it turns out a lot of them are based off of people who actually existed and who were
exactly.
he told those who had some of those experiences or told some of those stories. So it's definitely an act of imagination, but it's also an act of listening to the people around you. When I teach Appalachian literature, it's amazing how many of the authors, mostly fiction, say, I came from a family that being a fiction writer was not even a possibility, didn't even know it was a thing. But I came from a family where people love to sit on the porch and tell stories. And I learned about storytelling and the love of a good story from family, community, and then, so then it's just figuring out how to transfer that onto a page and how to write a novel, perhaps out of that. So, yeah.
I think one of the greatest things that you can do as a storyteller is to be I don't know what the word is, an observationist, to be a listener, to observe things, and that will spark that creativity for you. So
yeah. And if we're talking about different style, like nonfiction and fiction, one of the interesting things about McCarthy's last book, so like The Passenger is a big rambling traditional kind of novel in some ways. The last book that came right after that, Stella Maris, is much thinner, and it doesn't have any narration at all. It's entirely a dialogue between Alicia, that character I mentioned in earlier today, and her therapist or her psychologist. So there's no description, no setup. It's just a conversation. So it becomes almost like a drama. Your thing about movies, I imagine documentaries are a little different, but the movie script where you have to reveal through what's being said rather than the narrative exposition. I thought it was interesting that that's maybe the very last book he'll ever write, I think, or publish.
It's interesting that book is that way, and this has nothing to do with it, but just an observation. And I try to watch movies because I'm a big movie guy, and I find things interesting. And I watched a movie this week. It's a fairly new movie. It's based on a true story. It's called Reality. And it is about Reality Winner, who was working for the NSA in Augusta, Georgia, and was accused of leaking classified documents. And what was really fascinating about this was the entire script of the whole movie was the word for word transcript of the interview that the FBI had with Reality Winner at her house when they went to her house to talk to her. At the very beginning, you see the FBI agent turn on his recorder and put it in his front pocket. And you can tell that the script was word for word. There was nothing added to it. It was word for word what the transcript was. And they even used some techniques to go to the screen to show some audio waveforms and some transcript words and things such as that to reinforce the idea that that's what this was. Otherwise, it might have seemed like really bad screenwriting because it was just two people having a conversation, or two or three people having a conversation. But I thought that was really, really fascinating. That's beside the point. But
yeah,
storytelling can take lots of formats and methods. I guess that's my point.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of when you don't have that narrative. Sometimes that narrative thing can be almost like a easy way to steer the reader, but almost like a sort of cheating way of doing that. And to tell a story only through the dialogue between characters is, I would think, I mean, I'm also not a creative writer, but would be a very different way of thinking about how to tell a story.
All right. Well, very good. Well, we sure do appreciate you being with us, Bill, and sharing your insight. And it's good to hear about the connection that Oak Ridge had to those books and to his life.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it was great being on here, and I want to thank both of you, and want to thank Ray again for helping me figure out some of the Oak Ridge parts of this book when I first read it and was scratching my head about what was going on. Really helped tremendously with that.
Very good. Glad to do it.
Very
And
good.
Keith, you know, we'll return to our series with Benita at our next opportunity. So she's telling Bill, she's a retired teacher from the Oak Ridge High School, and she's reaching out to people who've graduated from the Oak Ridge schools who have made significant accomplishments, some of them world-renowned accomplishments in medicine and in science and other ways. It's amazing to find Oak Ridge graduates and what they're doing now. And she's helping us to research that. And Keith, she's agreed just in the last email with her. She's working hard on the book that'll pull
good.
all of them together. So we'll continue our conversation with Benita Albert at our next opportunity for Hidden Histories.
All right. Very good. All right, folks. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back soon with another Hidden History.